Sarah Coleman's life had settled into a pattern of predictable routines that brought her a sense of security, if not fulfillment. At 38, she had achieved what many would consider the basics of American success: a stable job as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in suburban Chicago, a modest ranch-style home with a small backyard, and enough financial stability to avoid immediate worries. Her days followed an unchanging rhythm, waking at precisely 6:15 a.m., preparing the same breakfast of coffee and toast, driving the same route to work, and spending 8 hours meticulously working with numbers that never judged her. Colleagues were cordial but distant, and Sarah preferred it that way. She had mastered the art of pleasant small talk that prevented deeper connections while maintaining professional relationships. What remained unaddressed by both Sarah and those around her was how her obesity had gradually reshaped her existence. At over 300 pounds, simple activities had become increasingly challenging. Airplane seats, restaurant booths, and office chairs presented daily anxieties that Sarah had learned to navigate through careful planning and avoidance. She had become expert at predicting and preventing potentially humiliating situations. This hypervigilance was exhausting, though Sarah rarely acknowledged this even to herself. Evening routines provided her greatest comfort. After work, Sarah would stop at one of 5 different takeout restaurants, rotating them through the week to avoid becoming too familiar with any staff, before returning home to eat while watching cooking shows or home renovation programs. These shows offered a window into transformation without requiring her participation. Food had evolved from mere sustenance into her most reliable companion, the one pleasure that never rejected her or made her feel inadequate. Sarah had convinced herself this comfortable predictability was preference rather than fear, choice rather than retreat. Her weight served as both explanation and excuse for her increasingly limited life, while simultaneously becoming the problem she believed made her unworthy of anything more. The morning that shattered Sarah's carefully constructed world began like any other. She arrived at Westbrook Financial Services at 8:27 a.m., exactly 3 minutes before her shift began, just as she had for the past 12 years. The unusual tension in the office should have been her first warning. Whispered conversations ceased when she approached, and the company president's door remained uncharacteristically closed all morning. At 11:42 a.m., the all-staff email arrived. Mandatory meeting 1 p.m., conference room A. Sarah's stomach tightened as she clicked through her spreadsheets with increasingly sweaty palms. The conference room felt suffocating as 50 employees squeezed inside. The CEO's speech was brief but devastating. Market conditions, necessary restructuring, regrettable decisions. The corporate euphemisms couldn't soften the reality. 30% of the staff would be let go immediately, their positions eliminated. When Sarah heard her department mentioned, she felt a peculiar floating sensation, as though watching herself from above. 2 decades of faithful service reduced to a cardboard box of desk items and a severance package that wouldn't last 3 months. Driving home in the middle of a workday felt surreal, almost illicit. Snow had begun falling heavily, unusual for February even in Chicago. Sarah was so distracted she nearly missed the telltale shimmer of water reflecting in her headlights as she turned onto her street. The fire trucks and emergency vehicles confirmed her growing dread before she even reached her driveway. A neighbor approached as she struggled out of her car, explaining that a main pipe had burst during the overnight freeze. Water had been flowing freely for hours before anyone noticed. The damage was catastrophic. Sarah stood in her soaked living room, watching as firefighters and emergency responders moved through her home. The water had risen nearly 8 inches before draining, destroying furniture, electronics, and worst of all, the structural integrity of her modest home. The insurance adjuster who arrived an hour later delivered the crushing news with practiced detachment. Her policy would cover only a fraction of the damage due to a coverage limitation she'd opted for years ago to save on premiums. Numb and disoriented, Sarah retreated to her car, where her phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Listening to her doctor's message was the final blow. "Sarah, your test results are concerning. Your A1C levels indicate pre-diabetes, and your blood pressure readings are in the danger zone. We need to discuss immediate intervention strategies. Please call my office as soon as possible to schedule an urgent follow-up appointment." 3 catastrophic losses, her job, her home, her health, converged in a perfect storm that swept away every semblance of stability Sarah had built. As she sat in her car, watching emergency workers move through her waterlogged home, while snowflakes accumulated on her windshield, Sarah felt her carefully constructed world collapsing around her, with the terrible finality of a house of cards meeting an unexpected breeze. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and mounting despair. Sarah moved into the lakeside extended stay motel, a place she'd driven past countless times without a second glance. Now room 118 became her temporary address, a cramped space with yellowing wallpaper and a kitchenette barely large enough to heat frozen meals. The room's persistent smell of old cigarettes and industrial cleaner became the backdrop to her unraveling life. Each morning brought new complications. The insurance company required endless documentation, most of which had been destroyed in the flooding. Negotiations with contractors revealed that repairs would cost nearly double what her insurance would cover. Sarah's savings, meticulously built over years of cautious living, dwindled with alarming speed. Medical bills arrived with intimidating red stamps, demanding payment for tests her former employer's insurance had covered just weeks earlier. When the structural engineer delivered his verdict, the foundation damage was too severe, making repairs economically unfeasible. Sarah faced the crushing reality of selling her water-damaged home at a devastating loss. The real estate agent didn't bother hiding his assessment. "Land value only, I'm afraid. The structure's a tear down." The sale price covered her remaining mortgage with barely $5,000 remaining, a pitiful sum to restart a life at 38. Sarah's health deteriorated in tandem with her circumstances. Without insurance, her newly prescribed medications cost nearly $400 monthly, money she simply didn't have. She tried rationing pills, taking them every other day, then every third day, until dizziness and fatigue made even basic tasks challenging. The prediabetes diagnosis demanded dietary changes she couldn't afford. Fresh produce and lean proteins cost substantially more than the carbohydrate-heavy foods that had been her staples. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Losing everything had somehow made healthy eating even more unattainable. Her weight, long a source of private shame, now became a daily physical burden she could no longer ignore. Climbing the single flight of stairs to her motel room left her winded and sweating. The chest pains that had once been occasional now became frequent visitors, particularly at night when anxiety peaked. Sleep offered little refuge, interrupted by panic attacks that left her gasping for breath, certain she was having a heart attack. Food, once her most reliable comfort, betrayed her as well. The panic attacks began striking during meals, her throat constricting mid-swallow, convinced she would choke. Some nights, Sarah sat before untouched takeout, too anxious to eat yet too hungry to discard it. On one particularly bleak evening, she found herself in the motel bathroom at 3 a.m., staring at her reflection in the harsh fluorescent light, unable to recognize the hollow-eyed woman looking back. The realization hit with crushing clarity. She had nothing left, no career, no home, no health, and now not even the comfort of food. She had finally hit rock bottom, with no idea how or if she could possibly climb back up. Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly how she ended up at the Oakwood Community Center. Perhaps it was the faded flyer she'd absently noticed on the bulletin board at the laundromat: free counseling services, no insurance required. Or maybe it was simply that she had nowhere else to go on a Tuesday morning when the motel rooms were being cleaned. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting area, surrounded by community announcements and children's artwork, feeling conspicuously out of place. She had nearly convinced herself to leave when a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes approached. "I'm Elaine," she said, extending her hand. "I have an opening now if you'd like to talk." There was something in Elaine's direct gaze, absent of the pity or judgment Sarah had come to expect, that made declining impossible. Elaine's office was small but welcoming, with plants crowding the windowsill and a comfortable chair that, to Sarah's relief, had no arms to squeeze against her sides. Sarah had prepared her story, ready to recite the familiar litany of recent disasters, the job loss, the flooding, the health crisis, expecting the usual sympathetic nods and generic advice about hanging in there. Instead, Elaine listened quietly, jotting occasional notes. When Sarah finished, expecting questions about her weight or eating habits, Elaine surprised her entirely. "When was the last time you felt truly alive, Sarah?" The question hung in the air between them, simple yet devastating in its precision. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Her mind scrambled through memories, job promotions, house purchase, family gatherings, searching for a moment of genuine aliveness. Nothing surfaced. I don't know," she finally admitted, the words barely audible. "That's where we'll start then," Elaine said, her voice matter-of-fact but gentle. "Not with what you've lost, but with what you've never had." The dam broke then, tears flowing with an intensity that shocked Sarah. She cried not for her recent losses, but for the decades spent merely existing, for the experiences never attempted, the joy never permitted, the life half-lived behind walls of fat and fear. When the tears finally subsided, Sarah felt hollowed out, yet somehow lighter. Elaine didn't offer platitudes or quick solutions. Instead, she handed Sarah a tissue and a small card with her schedule. "Change doesn't happen in one conversation," she said, "but it does happen with one step, then another, and another." As Sarah left the center that day, she didn't feel miraculously healed or suddenly motivated. There was no dramatic epiphany or moment of clarity. What she felt instead was the faintest flicker of something long dormant, not hope exactly, but perhaps its precursor, the recognition that her story wasn't yet finished. She had sought help not because she wanted to lose weight or find a job, but because for the first time in years, she wondered what it might feel like to be truly alive. 1 week after her first counseling session, Sarah sat in the back corner of a large room at the community center, watching others filter in for what the schedule called adaptive movement. She had nearly backed out a dozen times that morning. The thought of moving her body in front of strangers triggered waves of anxiety so intense she'd twice pulled into parking lots to catch her breath during the short drive over. Elaine's gentle persistence had finally won out. "Just observe if that feels better," she'd suggested. "No one will force you to participate." This compromise allowed Sarah to show up, though she'd deliberately arrived early to claim the least visible spot in the room. The instructor wasn't what Sarah expected. Marcus rolled into the room in a wheelchair, his powerful upper body contrasting with legs that appeared atrophied from disuse. He greeted each person by name, his voice warm with genuine interest in their responses. When he reached Sarah, he simply smiled and said, "First time's always the hardest. You've already done the difficult part by showing up." As the class assembled, Sarah was struck by the diversity of bodies gathering. There were elderly participants with canes and oxygen tanks, a young woman with what appeared to be cerebral palsy, several obese individuals like herself, and a middle-aged man with a prosthetic leg. This wasn't the intimidating fitness class of her imagination, with toned bodies and judgmental glances. Marcus positioned his wheelchair at the front of the room. "Today, as every day, we start by acknowledging what our bodies can do, not what they can't," he began. "Place your hands over your heart. Feel that. That's your body working perfectly in this moment." The simplicity of this gesture, feeling her heartbeat beneath her palm, unexpectedly moved Sarah. Her body, which she had long regarded as her enemy, was in this moment simply doing what bodies do, keeping her alive. The class progressed through gentle movements, each with modifications demonstrated by Marcus himself. "Find your edge without crossing it," he repeated. "Honor where you are today." Sarah surprised herself by attempting some of the seated movements, her body stiff but responsive. 45 minutes later, a light sheen of sweat covered her face. Her breath came faster, not from anxiety, but from effort. Her muscles felt awake in a way that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. As participants dispersed afterward, Marcus approached her. "What did you notice?" he asked simply. Sarah considered the question. "I noticed that I could do more than I thought," she answered truthfully. Marcus nodded, as if she'd said something profound. That's where it starts, not with weight or fitness goals or dramatic transformations, just with noticing what's possible today that maybe wasn't yesterday. Sarah learned later about Marcus's story. The championship basketball career ended by a drunk driver, the years of depression, and finally his discovery of adaptive movement. "I hated my body for betraying me," he told the class during her third session, "until I realized the betrayal was in my thinking, not in my body. My body was doing everything it could to heal." The words resonated deeply with Sarah. For the first time, she considered that perhaps her body wasn't her enemy, but had been doing its best under the circumstances she had given it. This subtle shift, from battling her body to listening to it, became the foundation for everything that followed. She began attending classes twice weekly, then 3 times, drawn not by determination to lose weight, but by curiosity about what her body might be capable of if given the chance. Sarah's routine expanded gradually as winter gave way to spring. What began as twice-weekly movement classes evolved to include a Monday morning community breakfast, where volunteers served simple but nourishing meals. At first, Sarah sat alone, focusing on her plate to avoid conversation. By her 3rd visit, however, a woman named Diane deliberately sat across from her, breaking the silence with a directness that made avoidance impossible. "You're in Marcus's class, right? Back corner, blue shirt." Diane was perhaps 70, rail-thin with cropped silver hair and large statement earrings that swung when she spoke. The colorful scarf wrapped around her head didn't quite disguise her hair loss. "Yes," Sarah admitted, unprepared for social interaction so early in the morning. "I've been watching you," Diane continued, spreading jam on her toast with methodical precision. "You're getting stronger. Your breathing's better." The observation, delivered without commentary or congratulation, caught Sarah off guard. Someone had noticed her, had seen changes she herself hadn't recognized. "I'm a retired phys ed teacher," Diane explained, misreading Sarah's surprise. 42 years watching bodies move. Now I'm on round 3 of chemo and I need someone to walk with. The doctors insist on daily movement, but my balance isn't reliable. "You free after breakfast?" The invitation, or was it a command, bypassed all of Sarah's usual social defenses. Before she could formulate an excuse, she found herself agreeing to a short walk around the community center grounds. That first walk lasted 15 minutes, with Diane occasionally steadying herself against Sarah's solid frame. They spoke little, both conserving breath. The next day, Diane appeared at breakfast with a matter-of-fact, "Same time," and their routine was established. As days stretched into weeks, their walks extended beyond the center's grounds to the small park 3 blocks away. Diane's blunt questions and observations gradually drew Sarah out of her shell. Unlike others who tiptoed around difficult subjects, Diane addressed them head-on. "What did you do before this place?" she asked one morning as they circled the park's perimeter. Sarah's abbreviated answer about accounting led to questions about numbers, systems, and organization. Diane listened with genuine interest, then shared stories of her own career, the challenges of teaching, the students who had touched her life, her late-life adoption of watercolor painting. Their conversations ranged widely as their daily route extended. Sarah found herself sharing thoughts she'd never voiced aloud. Her shame about financial failure, her complicated relationship with food, her loneliness. Diane offered neither pity nor platitudes, just attentive listening and occasional sharp insights from her own experiences with cancer, widowhood, and aging. Through Diane, Sarah met others at the center. Martin, who ran the food pantry after losing his restaurant to bankruptcy. Elena, a former lawyer now managing the center's legal aid program while battling multiple sclerosis. Jaden, a 19-year-old volunteer who had aged out of foster care and found community among the center's regulars. Each person carried their own struggles, none hidden beneath polished exteriors or social niceties. Their authenticity created a space where Sarah gradually shed her protective layers. One rainy afternoon, when their walk was cancelled, she found herself in the center's small library playing chess with Elena, then helping Jaden organize donations for the clothing exchange. 6 months earlier, Sarah had defined herself primarily through her isolation, the meals eaten alone, weekends passed without human contact, holidays spent with television characters as companions. Now, her phone contained actual contacts. Diane checking about tomorrow's walk time, Marcus sharing a modified exercise video, Elena inviting her to a community potluck. These weren't deep friendships yet, but they were connections, tenuous threads binding her to a world she had spent years avoiding. Sarah realized, with a mixture of regret and wonder, how much energy she had invested in keeping others at a distance, anticipating judgment about her size that sometimes existed only in her own expectations. The community center's financial crisis came to light during a volunteer meeting Sarah attended, primarily because Diane had insisted. "They need bodies in chairs," Diane had said with characteristic bluntness. "Just show up and nod occasionally." Sarah, still uncomfortable in group settings but increasingly unable to say no to Diane, had reluctantly agreed. The center's director, Gabriela Martinez, didn't sugarcoat the situation. Grant funding had fallen through, donations were down, and their bookkeeping system was in such disarray that they couldn't properly document expenses for potential funders. The center needed to raise $30,000 within 2 months or drastically cut services. The room buzzed with suggestions: bake sales, fundraising walks, community dinners, all well-intentioned but unlikely to generate sufficient funds in the time frame needed. Sarah sat quietly, her mind racing not with fundraising ideas but with calculations. After 3 decades of accounting work, she could practically see the disordered ledgers Gabriela described, the misclassified expenses, the overlooked deductions. Her fingers itched for a keyboard. "I could maybe help with the books," Sarah offered during a momentary lull, her voice so soft that Gabriela asked her to repeat herself. "I'm an accountant, was an accountant, for almost 20 years. I could look at your financial records, maybe organize things a bit." The relief on Gabriela's face was immediate. "Could you really? Our volunteer treasurer moved away 3 months ago, and none of us knows what we're doing. We have QuickBooks, but it's a mess." Sarah had expected to volunteer a few hours, perhaps provide some basic guidance. Instead, she found herself in a small office the next day, staring at financial records that made her professionally trained mind recoil. Years of well-meaning but amateur bookkeeping had created a labyrinth of misclassifications, duplicate entries, and reconciliation errors. What had intended to be a quick review became an 8-hour deep dive, with Sarah emerging only when the janitor needed to lock up. "I need more time," she told Gabriela, who had checked on her throughout the day. "There's actually more here than I thought, not just organization issues, but I think you've been missing some significant tax deductions and grant reporting opportunities." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah volunteered nearly 40 hours, reconstructing 3 years of financial records. The work absorbed her completely, calling on skills honed through decades of professional experience. She created new tracking systems, developed proper expense categorizations, and generated reports that clearly demonstrated the center's impact and needs. When she finally presented her findings to Gabriela and the board treasurer, their astonishment was evident. "This is professional-level work," the treasurer said, flipping through Sarah's meticulously prepared reports. "We need this ongoing, not just as a one-time fix." "I can keep volunteering," Sarah offered, surprised by how much she wanted to continue. The work had awakened something dormant, not just her technical skills, but the satisfaction of being truly useful. Gabriela and the treasurer exchanged glances. "Actually," Gabriela said carefully, "we've been approved for a part-time bookkeeper position. It's not much, 15 hours weekly at $18 an hour, but with your qualifications." The offer caught Sarah completely off guard. After months of rejection letters and unanswered applications, here was a job offer she hadn't even sought. More surprising was her immediate response: yes. Word of Sarah's financial wizardry spread quickly through the center's network. Martin asked if she could help organize his food pantry's chaotic donation tracking system. Elena wondered if Sarah might assist some legal aid clients with basic financial literacy. A single mother from the center's parenting program asked shyly if Sarah could review her budget. Within 2 months, Sarah had accumulated a small but growing list of independent clients, community members and small businesses who needed affordable accounting services. She set up a simple website using a template, created business cards at the center's computer lab, and registered her new business, Balanced Books Financial Services. What began as a desperate offer to help had transformed into an unexpected resurrection of her professional identity. Not in a corporate setting with its rigid hierarchies and appearance-focused culture, but in a community that valued her skills over her size. For the first time in her career, Sarah found herself helping people who actually needed her expertise, whose lives and small businesses tangibly improved through her work. The gratitude in their eyes when she untangled their financial confusions was worth more than any performance bonus she'd ever received. Sarah didn't notice the changes in her body at first. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no epiphany while looking in a mirror. Instead, the transformation happened in quiet increments, registered primarily through practical observations. Her knees hurt less after walking. She could bend to tie her shoes without losing her breath. She slept through the night more often than not. The morning walks with Diane had gradually extended from 15 minutes to nearly an hour. When Diane's cancer treatments intensified, temporarily sidelining her, Sarah surprised herself by continuing alone. The routine had become a necessity rather than an obligation, a time to clear her mind before diving into client work, to process thoughts without the background static of anxiety that had once been her constant companion. One drizzly Tuesday, avoiding puddles along their usual route, Diane mentioned a weekend hiking group she'd joined during her previous remission. Nothing extreme, just nature trails at the state park. Good group of old-timers like me. They're doing the Lakeside Loop this Saturday, you should come. 5 months earlier, Sarah would have declined immediately, offering a flurry of excuses. Instead, she found herself considering it. How long is the loop? 3 miles, mostly flat. Some pretty views of the water. We take our time. That Saturday, wearing her only pair of athletic shoes and carrying a water bottle in an old tote bag, Sarah joined 8 strangers in a parking lot at Willow Creek State Park. To her relief, the group was diverse in both age and body type, with several participants older than Diane and at least 2 who were also larger-bodied. The hike changed something fundamental in Sarah's relationship with movement. Unlike the community center, with its fluorescent lighting and mirrored walls, the forest trail offered a different context entirely. Here, her body wasn't an object to be improved, but a vehicle for experience. for feeling the spring breeze, for navigating uneven terrain, for carrying her to vistas of unexpected beauty. No one cared how she looked hiking. They simply welcomed another person who appreciated the quiet communion with nature. Sarah began joining the weekend hikes regularly. When one of the group mentioned a beginner's water aerobics class at the YMCA, Sarah found herself signing up, drawn by the promise of movement without the impact that sometimes still troubled her knees. Her first time in a public pool since childhood triggered intense anxiety. Purchasing a swimsuit had been an ordeal, ended only by Diane's exasperated, "Just buy the damn thing. No one looks good in lycra anyway." Entering the pool area, Sarah had braced for stares or whispers. Instead, she found a collection of imperfect bodies, scarred, wrinkled, marked by surgeries and pregnancies and life, all moving through water with evident enjoyment. The weightlessness was revelatory. In water, Sarah's body became buoyant and responsive, capable of movements that remained challenging on land. The instructor, a grandmotherly woman with impressive muscle definition, created an atmosphere of playful exploration rather than regimented exercise. Sarah left that first class with her hair dripping, her face flushed, and a peculiar lightness that wasn't just physical. Her eating patterns shifted with similar subtlety. There was no dramatic diet, no elimination of food groups or counting of points. Instead, there was a gradual reawakening of actual hunger and fullness cues that had been buried beneath years of emotional eating. Sarah noticed she craved different foods after hiking, fresh, hydrating options rather than the heavy, numbing choices that had once been her default. The community center's cooking classes, which she joined initially to support a client organizing their budget, introduced her to simple, nourishing meals that could be prepared in her small apartment kitchen. By the time 18 months had passed since her first desperate visit to the community center, Sarah had lost over 100 pounds. Yet when people commented on her weight loss, she found herself strangely disconnected from their congratulations. The number on the scale, which had once been the arbiter of her worth, now seemed almost irrelevant compared to the real changes. Her increased energy, her improved sleep, her ability to climb 3 flights of stairs when the elevator in a client's building was out of service. More significant than any physical change was her evolving relationship with her body. Sarah had spent decades at war with her flesh, treating it as an enemy to be conquered, a shameful burden to be hidden. Now she found herself, if not quite at peace with her body, then at least engaged in a more respectful negotiation. Her body would never match cultural ideals of beauty. She would always be large-framed, always carry certain fat deposits resistant to change, but it could be strong, capable, and deserving of basic care. The email from Westbrook Financial Services arrived on a Tuesday morning, nestled between client invoices and a community center newsletter. Sarah nearly deleted it, assuming it was a marketing message from her former employer. The subject line stopped her. Senior Financial Analyst Position, Interview Request. The message was from Thomas Richards, once a mid-level manager she had barely known at Westbrook, now apparently their Director of Operations. They were creating a new department focused on non-profit financial services and seeking someone with both corporate experience and understanding of community organizations. Her name had come up through LinkedIn when they searched for former employees with relevant experience. Sarah's first instinct was to decline immediately. The thought of returning to corporate culture, its politics, its appearance-focused judgments, its emphasis on fitting in, made her stomach clench. Yet curiosity compelled her to research the position. The salary was nearly double what she currently earned through her combined part-time work and growing client base. The benefits package included comprehensive health insurance, which she still lacked. Most intriguingly, the position involved helping non-profit organizations navigate financial challenges, work that aligned with her newfound sense of purpose. After 3 days of deliberation and a long conversation with Elaine, Sarah replied, accepting the interview. The week that followed triggered anxiety she hadn't experienced in months. She obsessed over appropriate interview attire, knowing her body, while smaller than before, still didn't fit corporate expectations. She rehearsed answers to anticipated questions about her employment gap and sudden departure. Most of all, she worried about encountering former colleagues who had known her at her heaviest, particularly Lisa Kendall, the HR director who had always managed to make Sarah feel invisible despite sitting 10 feet from her for years. The morning of the interview, Sarah stood before her mirror, dressed in a newly purchased navy suit. The woman reflected back was neither the obese, self-effacing accountant of 2 years prior, nor some dramatically transformed version who had achieved conventional beauty standards. She was simply Sarah, still heavy by societal measures, but carrying herself with a dignity that came from surviving collapse and rebuilding on her own terms. Westbrook's offices were exactly as she remembered. The same corporate artwork, the same subtle scent of electronics and coffee, the same hushed atmosphere of contained ambition. What had changed was her perception of the environment. What once seemed intimidating now felt merely theatrical, a stage set where everyone performed prescribed roles. Thomas Richards greeted her warmly, seemingly oblivious to any physical changes. The interview panel included 2 people she didn't recognize and, as feared, Lisa Kendall. Lisa's momentary widening of eyes confirmed she noted Sarah's altered appearance, but her professional mask quickly reasserted itself. The technical questions about accounting practices, non-profit regulations, and financial analysis were straightforward. Sarah answered confidently, drawing on both her corporate experience and recent work with community organizations. When asked about the employment gap, she answered honestly but selectively. A personal health crisis coincided with losing my home to water damage. During recovery, I discovered my passion for helping community organizations manage their finances effectively. It was the final question, posed by Lisa with a hint of challenge that might once have derailed her. You've worked independently for some time now. Why return to corporate structure? And specifically, why Westbrook? 2 years ago, Sarah would have offered a placating answer designed to reassure them of her compliance with corporate norms. The new Sarah paused, considering her authentic response. I'm not interested in returning to just any corporate role, she finally said. What draws me to this position specifically is the opportunity to bridge 2 worlds I understand well: corporate financial systems and community organizations doing essential work with limited resources. Many nonprofits struggle because they lack financial expertise, while corporations often miss opportunities to create meaningful community impact because they don't understand non-profit structures. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. As for why Westbrook, frankly, your resources and reach would allow this work to help more organizations than I can serve independently. That said, I've built a successful practice working directly with community groups. I'm exploring whether Westbrook's new department aligns with my professional values, just as you're assessing whether my skills match your needs. Lisa's raised eyebrow reflected surprise at this unexpectedly assertive answer. Thomas, however, nodded approvingly. The interview concluded with standard discussions of next steps and timeline. Walking out of the Westbrook building, Sarah felt a clarity that had nothing to do with whether she received a job offer. The woman who had shrunk herself, physically and emotionally, to fit corporate expectations no longer existed. Whatever came next would be on her terms, reflecting values forged through collapse and rebuilding rather than the desperate need for approval that had once driven her. On a warm September morning, exactly 2 years since her first visit to the Oakwood Community Center, Sarah stood in the small backyard of her newly purchased home. The property was nothing like her previous house, smaller, older, with worn hardwood floors instead of plush carpet. But it was unmistakably hers, bought with a combination of her salary from Westbrook's non-profit division, where she now worked 3 days weekly, and income from her independent consulting practice, which she maintained the other 2 days. The garden behind the house had been overgrown when she purchased the property 4 months earlier. Now, raised beds built with Martin's help contained late-season vegetables, tomatoes heavy with fruit, peppers in vibrant yellows and reds, herbs sending up their fragrant greeting in the morning sun. Sarah moved between the plants, harvesting what was ripe, her movements comfortable and purposeful in the space she had created. Inside, her kitchen counter held handwritten recipe cards, some from the community center's cooking classes, others from Diane, a few from the hiking group's potluck gatherings. Tonight would be her 3rd monthly dinner party, a tradition she had started impulsively after moving in. The guest list included familiar faces from various corners of her reconstructed life. Diane, now in remission, Marcus and his wife, Eleanor, from legal aid, 2 clients turned friends from her accounting practice, and her new colleague Zoe from Westbrook. The dinner parties had begun as a gesture of gratitude, a way to thank the people who had supported her through transformation. They had quickly evolved into something more vital, a conscious practice of creating the connection she had denied herself for decades. Sarah's home, unlike her previous house, wasn't a fortress against social interaction, but a gathering place where her newly discovered gifts could be shared. As she chopped vegetables for the evening's ratatouille, Sarah reflected on the interview at Westbrook that had crystallized her journey. She had received their job offer a week later, not for the position she'd interviewed for, but for a newly created role as Director of Community Financial Services, working 3 days weekly with non-profits while maintaining her independent practice. Thomas had called personally to explain the unusual arrangement. Your comment about bridging worlds made us realize we need someone with feet planted firmly in both. Would you consider a flexible arrangement that allows you to continue your community work? Her acceptance had come with clear boundaries about schedule, expectations, and most importantly, respect. At their first team meeting, she had encountered Lisa from HR in the elevator, the woman who had once made her feel so invisible. Lisa's attempt at a compliment, "You look amazing, the weight loss is incredible," was met with Sarah's calm reply, "Thank you, but I'd rather be recognized for my professional contributions than my appearance." The moment had passed without awkwardness, a small but significant recalibration of their dynamic. Sarah's body, the battleground of so much self-loathing and societal judgment, had reached its own equilibrium. She remained, by medical standards, overweight, her body stubbornly retaining some of the padding that had once protected her from a world she feared. Regular movement, nourishing food, and adequate rest had become non-negotiable aspects of her life, but not its centerpiece or moral compass. Her worth was no longer measured in pounds lost or sizes dropped, but in clients helped, friendships nurtured, and personal boundaries honored. The most profound transformation had nothing to do with weight at all. Sarah had lost nearly everything external: job, home, health, financial security, and in that stripped-down state had finally confronted her fundamental beliefs about her own value. The revelation wasn't that she was worthy despite her size, but that her worth had never been connected to her body at all. It existed intrinsically, requiring neither achievement nor alteration to justify its presence. As evening approached, and Sarah set her dining table for 8, a table that would have overwhelmed her previous life with its implications of social obligation, she felt a deep contentment that transcended happiness. Her life now wasn't perfect. She still battled occasional anxiety, still navigated a world that often equated thinness with worth, still sometimes caught herself in patterns of negative self-talk. The difference was that these challenges no longer defined her existence or limited her participation in life. The doorbell rang, announcing Diane's characteristically early arrival. Sarah moved to answer it, no longer rehearsing apologies for her home, her appearance, her existence. She opened the door wide, welcoming her friend without reservation, stepping fully into the space she had finally claimed for herself in the world. Have you ever experienced a situation where losing something important, like Sarah losing her job, home, and health, ultimately led to discovering something more valuable about yourself? How did that experience change your perspective on what truly matters in life? This question invites reflection on how adversity, while painful, can sometimes strip away external identities and force us to confront deeper truths about our inherent worth, just as Sarah's journey led her to discover that her value was never tied to her weight, appearance, or professional status. Did you like this story? Don't forget to leave a like to support this content that aims to raise awareness and create change. Subscribe to the channel to receive more inspiring stories that challenge prejudices and expand our perspective on the world. And if you know someone who can benefit from this message, share now. Together, we can build a society that celebrates all bodies and recognizes that human value goes far beyond physical appearance. Until the next story.